like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the Jay Burton Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
I know it's been a while since you were on last. Our episodes are always highly anticipated and received very well. So I'm really glad to have you back on. This will probably be a relatively long episode, and you know what? You've been on a few times before. So do you want to just launch straight into this, because we got a lot of ground to cover?
Absolutely. So we're covering different folkways from the colonial heritage of America. So we're going through the Anglo groups, the diasporas from England that settled colonial era America. We've already talked about the Puritans of Massachusetts, and we've talked about the Cavaliers of Virginia. Today we're going to talk about the Scotch-Irish. And I recently had the privilege to go on speaking tours, giving history talks in Tennessee. And I was talking about the Scotch-Irish frequently while I was there. So the information is all very fresh on my mind, and it's a lot of fun. They're definitely a crowd-pleasing bunch. So I've got here a slideshow that we've built into the show to present today. And so you'll have some audio and visual elements here. If you're watching the video, you'll see. The story of the Scotch-Irish starts on what are called the borderlands of northern England and the south of Scotland. This area was a particularly violent region, subject to invasions and counter invasions going back and forth for several hundred years. So about 7 centuries of more or less constant violence on these borderlands, where the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England were at constant war with one another. About 1040 to 1745, that period of history was almost continual warfare. There was plenty of warfare there before. Even back in Roman times, the Emperor Hadrian was compelled to build a wall on that border between Scotland and England, because the Romans had Romanized the south of the kingdom, what is now called England. They had settled that area and governed it for a period of time, but they never got up into what is now Scotland. So that remained Celtic and culturally and linguistically and racially distinct from Angleterre. And there was an awful lot of border incursions in that area. Even back in Roman times, the area was a violent place. So Hadrian's Wall, which I have an image of here on the next slide. Oh, here we go. Oh, here's the border marches, the region that we're discussing. You can see the province of Northumbria and the lowlands of Scotland. That's the area that we're talking about. This is the region. And here is Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian's Wall was built at the time of Christ, and this was a Roman construction, and there were military forts that were built all along the way. And that was to keep the wild Celtic tribes from Scotland from invading Romanized Britain. And that's part of the martial tradition of this region. This was a place where rival cultures and opposed kingdoms would clash with one another. Now, one of the results of this was this region, which was formerly forested, was overlogged for several centuries. The forests were permanently destroyed in the region. The people in this region had to rebuild their homes, their fences, their barns so many times that they utterly destroyed the logging potential of these forests eventually, and the area was made kind of desolate as a result. So the moors of northern England are one of the geographical results of this long period of sustained violence that the region endured. So the people of the area eventually started building sod huts, and the more capable, those that were able to better invest, started building more out of stone. But the traditional way of building housing and such in this area long before was logs. They used wooden huts and such, and they would make more rough hewn sorts of housing out of wood, but wood became so scarce they had to stop doing that. You can advance the slide. So one of the results of the martial tradition of the region were fortified houses, many of which still stand. Now, these were the houses of the more capable people, the people that had substance and means. They built themselves fortified residences, and they're called bastille houses, which is related to the French word bastille, which of course is a reference to a castle, a keep, a stone tower where you can resist a siege potentially. So there are a number of these that still stand around in the low areas of Scotland and the north areas of England, this area that had been subject to all of these invasions. You can advance. The next several pictures show examples of these. There was one that had that fortified entrance on the front that you could see. This is another curious feature. This is the Penrith Beacon. This is another relic of this violent period of the borderlands. This was a bonfire that was built in a sheltered stone tower, and it was manned by a watchman who would watch for an invading army to come over the next hill. So when an army revealed itself in the region, he would light the beacon to warn people at a distance that an invasion was underway. And the Penrith Beacon was actually used during the Jacobite uprising up in Scotland in the 18th century. So that's another relic of the borderlands and a testimony to the violent heritage of the region. So one of the results of this heritage, people like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, people that are celebrated in story and in film, they left stories behind for the people of this region, stories of patriotism, stories of love of one's homeland, stories of personal sacrifice and martial valor. They left these stories, these legacies, and people like Andrew Jackson, who later becomes president, the first president from Tennessee, spoke very highly of people like William Wallace of Scotland as an example of a native patriot who lost everything, fighting for his country. The legacy of the region and its the constant battles that were fought over the control of this area was somewhat mollified by the elevation of King James from the throne of Scotland to the throne of England. King James, the same king who authorized the translation of the Bible into English, what we call the King James Bible, was James Stuart of Scotland. The Stuart family of Scotland was intermarried with the Tudor family of England, and when Queen Elizabeth the Great died, King James of Scotland, James the 16th, he was of Scotland, already King of Scotland at that time, was made King of both Scotland and England. It became James the First of England. Now, the story of the Stuarts is an involved story that I don't intend to get in here. We know the Stuarts ruled England. They were the legitimate kingly line of England for a period, and then they were eventually overthrown, and a series of wars resulted from that. Couple of different wars, first with Oliver Cromwell, and then later on with James II and the so-called Glorious Revolution. When the Stuarts were kicked out of the line of kings for England, and James II was exiled, partly because he had converted to Roman Catholicism, and Parliament was taking the side of the Protestants of England. War broke out in Scotland again, and so the conflict on the borders was renewed. So it was in the midst of many hundreds of years of martial daring do and strife and poverty that had resulted from this land that had been so thoroughly cleansed of useful implements. You had a very poor region that came out of all of this conflict. One of the results of this was that, according to the historian David Fisher, families grew into clans, and kinsmen placed fidelity to family above loyalty to the crown itself. So these people were intensely loyal to what was nearby and intensely drawn to those organic connections between people. This was not, we wouldn't say that this was a nationalism that Fisher is describing here. It is more of a clan-based social order where your loyalty to your family is the most important thing, and families stuck together and cooperated with one another. This was a very important way that these people managed to survive all of this turmoil. So it wasn't the Scots versus the English so much as it was the clan MacDonald versus the world, if you can understand it in those terms. These people were well known for having arms and knowing how to use them. Even if they did not have the medieval social status and rank that was typical of medieval Europe, these people did not always have a family crest or the ceremonial coat of arms. Here are some examples of coats of arms of the Maxwells. That coat of arms in medieval Europe would signify the status that you had to bear arms. So an example of, say, medieval England or medieval France would be most everyone was a serf. The majority of the population, the vast majority of the population, had a peasant status in medieval Europe. So these people would be obliged to live in a kind of farmer's hut, which was provided by the lord of the manor. They lived in a pattern rather like you see here. These fields divided by walls with little huts in every allotment. Now, these allotments were extremely old, and we know something of the origin of these going all the way back to the invasions of the Visigoths and the Huns and such at the close of the Roman Empire. You see even written accounts from some of the original land barons of that period who have Romans coming to them and begging for protection back then, willing to take lodging on the landlord's farm and to pay a rent in farm commodities. This was the original feudal relationship. If you could go back a slide, the feudal relationship meant that the lord of the manor would protect his serfs and he would provide them with necessaries to live as a farmer. So the lord of the manor would provide the hut that his serfs lived in. He would provide the land that they lived on. He would feed them in times of famine, assuming he had the resources to do so, of course. He would protect them when an invading army, like the Huns, came through the neighborhood. And he would also administrate law amongst them. So if there were criminals in the community, he would capture the criminal, try the criminal, punish or even execute the criminal. So we see that the feudal lords had all the authorities of a political executive, like a king or a president in our system. But they had much more connection. We see, he's setting out the serfs to work his land. Now there is a key difference here between serfdom and slavery, and that is the serfs were tied to a specific plot of land for many generations. This is a relationship that could last for 1,000 years or more. So it's a very rooted existence. These people do not move around. And that's one of the key differences between a serf and a slave. A slave can be bought and sold. The slave can be moved from plot to plot. A slave can have different lords or masters in that case. The serf has the same place, though the lord could be displaced by another lord. These lords will go to war with one another because sometimes they're actually politically sovereign. There are counts that are independent of kings and things like that. And they can go to war with one another and consolidate holdings. The duke can come along and kill the count in battle and seize the count's holdings, and then the serf has a new lord. But the serf's lord may be removed at a distance, made less personable, but the serf's life doesn't change very much. So that was the situation for in normal feudal Europe. Feudal Europe, where they aren't constantly at war and the whole thing isn't getting burned down every 10 years. In Scotland, it was working a little differently. If you would go back one more slide. In Scotland, it was, or in the lowlands of Scotland and the north of England, I should say the borderlands, which encompasses both England and Scotland in this region. It was very common for a feudal serf to own weapons and know how to use them. Now, this was not the case in medieval France. All right. In medieval France, the peasant might have things he could conceivably fight with. He might have a shovel. He might have a pitchfork, right? He's got farm tools, but he doesn't have a sword. A sword is something like a luxury good, right? They're extremely expensive compared to a wooden shovel. The sword is something that's necessary just to survive in this land, as necessary as knowing how to bring food out of the ground. So these people, even though they were never raised from the status of a serf or a peasant, they still know how to fight. They know how to defend themselves. They have weapons of war, even if they don't have the feudal status that goes with it. Now, the old way, I should say, like the standard feudal practice was the lord of the manor could call his peasants to go into battle on his behalf. That was a pretty bad idea because these were people that were used to growing turnips with wooden shovels or something. They did not know how to handle themselves. They were not disciplined for soldiering. But occasionally there were people that went into battle from this common status or impressed their lord in some martial respect. And those were the circumstances in which men were knighted. And this is a ceremony that we know something of from the lore or from film or something. You can imagine the king with the sword in his hand, and he tells his subordinate to kneel, and then he unsheathes his sword and he places his sword on the man's shoulders, and he goes back and forth from shoulder to shoulder with the tip of his sword laying the flat edge of the sword on, or the flat blade of the sword on the shoulder, and he says, I dub thee Sir Reginald, or whatever. And the man is raised in medieval social status. Now he is a man at arms. Now he is a knight. And of course, the knight has, as his name suggests, a certain kind of status. He has a certain kind of martial ability. The knight has he's a member of the chivalric orders, and chivalry refers to horsemanship. So a knight may have enough resources to own a horse, whereas the typical peasant didn't have anything like that in the way of resources. The knight also has status to have arms. So the knight is free. The knight is not tied to a particular plot of land and obliged to grow a bushel of turnips every year for his rent, right? Which was the typical lot of the serf. So there was meritocracy in the feudal system, and it was a meritocracy that was very much focused on martial daring do. You go into battle, you impress your lord. You can impress your count or your duke or anyone. That man that may just elevate you in the consequence of that. And that was the story of my family. Not to tell you my family name, but one of my ancestors impressed a king of England and was knighted for his effort. And my family has had the name of that event ever since. So that's where many of our family names come from in the Western world. Well, all that to say, I'm kind of painting the story of how it was in a less war-torn society than the borderlands. The borderlands were the exception to that rule. So in medieval Europe, only people with a medieval social status typically owned weapons. In the borderlands, the common man had weapons. And that's because the place was so violent that having weapons and knowing how to use them was essential for survival there. Now you can advance the slide. So the borderlands were a place severely affected by the end of feudalism. So this situation, this social arrangement that I was describing, formerly used to have a lot of agricultural labor on the lands. Now, this was a product partly of the end of the Roman Empire, when everyone is looking to find competent authority locally that can administrate them in the absence of Roman authorities, protect them from invaders in the absence of the Roman army. They were willing to actually sign up for this. And we know this to be true because we have examples of contracts of Roman citizens who consigned themselves and all of their heirs to this feudal serf relation to a lord, and that lord was maybe a former Roman official or a former Roman soldier, someone who had some executive capability, some courage, some weapons and training, so that they could fill that role. And those were eventually people who started building themselves fortified houses, because that was part of the feudal relation. They would offer protection to their peasants in times of foreign danger and invasion. Well, by the 18th century, this was not something that was working out well for the aristocrats of Scotland and England. They had an awful lot of serfs down on the farm that they were obliged to. Okay, this was not a one-sided relationship. Also, those old contracts stipulating the terms of service for these serfs, which the serfs couldn't change, it eventually worked very much out in the serfs' favor, because the serfs were obliged to provide, say, a bushel of turnips a year, or so many bales of wool a year to the feudal lord in exchange for provision, protection, criminal administration, things like that. After several centuries, inflation had reduced the value of those commodities to a mere pittance. They didn't change the quantity over the centuries, and so as these commodities grew more common and less expensive, this turned into a very bad deal for the lords. The lords wanted to get rid of the serfs. They wanted to abolish the feudal relationship. Now, we typically think of this in as part of the story of liberation, and this is due to the influence of the Whig historians of England and the progressives of that day, who tended to belong to that aristocratic landowning class. I'm not here to bash aristocrats. I really like these people, but nevertheless, they wrote self-serving stories about the emancipation of the peasantry and the end of feudalism. And they say, well, this is the advent of the new age of freedom. We're going to enfranchise these people and stuff. We're going to kick them off the land where their ancestors had been living for the last 1,000 years. They're going to go into the city and get a job. Okay, so between 1600 and 1800, especially in the 18th century, this process of enclosing the fields on these old feudal estates was well underway. Now, every single enclosure of an estate required an act of parliament to accomplish. So the barons, the landowners, were taking their case individually, one after the other, to Parliament to beg for relief from their feudal obligations. What they did, instead of having dozens of lots full of peasants growing turnips or whatever, they enclosed the common areas that the peasants used to rely on, areas used for water, areas used for fuel, areas used for common pasture, for the domestic animals of these people. If they had goats or cows or sheep or something, this is where they would graze. The lords were able to enclose those areas, and this made continuance on the feudal lots impossible for most. And they were able to transfer their economic system from this feudal agrarian lifestyle to a more modern commercial wage-based economy. So the peasants then go into the towns and cities and look for jobs. Now, at the exact same time, the people enclosing the land in the borderlands are shifting their business from the production of edible commodities to the strict production of wool. So they start growing lots of sheep, and the towns that are swelled with these former peasants all looking for work, they start building textile mills in the 18th century. So these borderers from the north of England, south of Scotland, these martial people who are very distinctive, they do not like city life. This is a defining characteristic for them. They don't like working for the man, they don't like the factories, and they don't like city life. So a large number of them end up going over to the north of Ireland. So they go to what's called the Ulster Plantation. Now, part of the reason for the Ulster Plantation is the British Empire is trying to assimilate the Irish in that area. The Irish have been a very unruly colony for the British Empire, and they want to populate these shires in the north with lots of Protestants. So they send over these borderers from this region in large numbers, partly because they really want to be on the farm. So they go over to the Ulster Plantation and they live sometimes for 1 or 2 generations over here in the Ulster Plantation. Now, a great number of them do stay there. And that's one of the reasons why Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom to this day. To this day, it's culturally distinct. It has more of an English character, you might say, more ties with Great Britain across the Irish Sea, and the Ulster Plantation is successful in making that part of Ireland more British, you might say. But doesn't mean that they pacify it. It had a reputation as a violent place until rather recently. Lots of native Catholic Irish up in arms with the newer set of Ulster Protestants. But you had these dispossessed peasant tenants that were going over to the Ulster Plantation. They are in contrast and sometimes in conflict with the native Irish population. They do intermarry with them. Okay, and this is mostly the more footloose and adventurous young men who go into the Ulster Plantation, and they naturally want to settle down, find a wife, and have a family. They marry with the Roman Catholic population. They marry Catholic women, and they predominate in their religious life. So the children of those unions tend to become Presbyterian or Baptist. There are some other low church sectarian groups. And that is the story of the Ulster Plantation. Also, there are lots of young men who are sent from the Scottish borderlands to Ulster as a form of punishment because they were felons. So the Ulster Plantation also serves as a penal colony for the borderlands. And that's another way that these borderers end up in Ulster. So they continue to move on. Now, this is why the borderers come to be known as the Scotch-Irish, because they have this old connection in the borderlands of Scotland, and then they have this new connection and this mixture of Celtic roots there in Ulster. Some of the intermarriage with the Irish population that was known to happen there. And then they start coming to America. And they come to America in large numbers, partly because there's so much more opportunity for them to settle down in what becomes the United States. So in the mid-18th century, so this is a pretty late group to arrive in the English colonies. The Scotch-Irish initially come in large numbers into Pennsylvania. Now, one of the reasons why they go into the Pennsylvania backcountry is because the Quakers of Philadelphia really want them there. They see a usefulness for them. These are men who are hard scrabble. They really want to go out into the wilderness. They want to be away from people. They're used to a rustic setting. They fiercely desire an agrarian kind of lifestyle. They want to farm. They want to be independent. They want to be away from the cities. They do not want to work for wages. They want to farm and don't much care how difficult the environment might be. They are also of a very pugnacious character. They have weapons. They know how to use them. They are inclined to fight. And the Quakers have a special problem because the Quakers are pacifists, and they have gone to Pennsylvania with starry-eyed notions about peace with the Indians and all that. Well, it turns out that not all the Indians really want peace with the Quakers, and they are assaulting Quaker settlements on the frontier of Pennsylvania and massacring the inhabitants. Now, the Quaker situation is really extraordinary, and you have to have an admiration of a kind for these people. There's something perverse about them at a certain point. When the Indians would massacre these frontier settlements, many of these Quakers, not all, but many of them, were content to watch stoically as the Indians massacred their entire families because they believed so strongly in pacifism that no violence could ever be legitimate. Now, there's something really extraordinary about that as a stoic achievement, a philosophical detachment. But there is something very perverse about that as well. It seems unbelievable that such a thing would happen. But the Quakers, they needed the Scotch-Irish to go out onto the frontier, into the Appalachians in central Pennsylvania, to fight the Indians and to be a military frontier barrier with the Indians. So the Quakers could stay in their cities in the east of the state, and the center of the state, as we know, became much more like West Virginia is now. Well, the Scotch-Irish found that they loved the Appalachians. This gave them the independence, the privacy, the detachment from the more standardized ways of living that was typical of the coast. They took the wagon roads down the Appalachians, and of course I suppose if you're from that region of the country, you know of central Pennsylvania as a place full of Scotch-Irish heritage. Many Americans, when they think of the Scotch-Irish, they're thinking of the southern Appalachians. They may be specifically thinking of North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And those are areas that are very rich in that Scotch-Irish heritage. A tremendous number of these Scotch-Irish, they started out in Pennsylvania and then they moved south. They went down the long, fin-like ridges of the Appalachians, the Allegheny Range, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they followed the lines of those mountains down to places like Tennessee and North Alabama. They brought with them, as every immigrant group brings, they brought with them their culture. They brought with them their fierce militant Presbyterianism, where they were known to go into the wilderness with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. They brought with them their values of independence, a preference for the rustic countryside, and their pugnacious and martial character, and their fierce insistence on weapons ownership and such. Now, in religion, the Scotch-Irish were known to be primarily Presbyterian, though there are other groups among them, such as the Primitive Baptists with a very stark and iconoclastic sort of approach to their worship. The Scotch-Irish were known to be people who disparaged the forms of the Church of England. They did not like written prayers. They believed that the clergy should be people called to the service. They believed that a clergyman should have an intense religious experience and feel a call from God to serve. They were very suspicious of what they called the hireling clergy. Those are people who are paid to go and be a clergyman. Also, people who went off to seminary. There was lots of skepticism of that kind of thing. Maybe of a preference for a kind of romantic instruction in theology, self-guided instruction, more typical of low church traditions of Protestantism. One Anglican clergyman who left us a very curious and an amusing account of the Scotch-Irish up in the mountains was Reverend Charles Woodmason, who in the mid-18th century went out into the sticks on horseback with saddlebags full of books of common prayer, by which he attempted to, or he aimed to civilize the religious mores of the Scotch-Irish up in the mountains. Curiously, just as a note, that term Scotch-Irish seems to be specific to America. If you talk to the British about this, my understanding is that they do not use that term. And if you talk to an Ulsterman about it from Northern Ireland, he wouldn't approve of the term. And even the American Scotch-Irish, they preferred to be called Scots rather than Scotch-Irish. They didn't like the connection with the admixture of the Irish. But anyway, Charles Woodmason, he went out into the woods with his books of common prayer, and he was assailed by hostile frontiersmen, very rough people, who threw his books of common prayer into the river and hogtied him and carried him away. Now, Woodmason expected to be very badly treated by these people, but when he was brought to the camp, he was kind of expecting the worst. He was expecting they would kill him or something. But they said they didn't like the hireling clergy. They didn't like written prayers. But when they got to the camp, they said, if you will preach to us for the next several days, we want hell, fire, and brimstone sermons. We will much appreciate that. And so the Woodmason obliged them. He preached the sermons that they suggested, and he was very amused that they liked that very much. They wanted very emotional teaching in their religious worship. Another example of that tradition in the mountains of the South is the revival meeting or the tent meeting, which was a aspect of religious life in this part of the country. Here is an illustration of a tent meeting. One of the reasons why this was an efficient way of worship for some of these people is because they lived so far away from one another. They were not huddled together in towns. They were spread across the landscape. These are people that didn't like living in towns. They didn't much care for the life of a merchant or professional life in a city. Say they much preferred the independence of living as free farmers or even as squatters out in the countryside. And so they still had a religious life. They would come together because they didn't much like hiring a clergyman and paying a man to preach. They rather disparaged professionalism of most sorts, or didn't cultivate it at all. They were too independent for that, or too individualist for that. They would come together for tent meetings and even occasionally larger revival meetings where a traveling preacher would come through and offer them sermons and religious instruction. Now, this did have the effect over time of multiplying religious sects in this area. You can advance the slide now. So the personal testimony was an aspect of that religious life that remains a very important part of these religious sectarian groups to this day. These low church Protestant groups, the idea is not so much what you would find, say, in a liturgical form of worship, which is typically more sacramental in its focus. The idea in a liturgical variety of Christianity is that the rite that is performed in the religious context, that does something to you spiritually. So the idea is that baptism does remit sin, as the creed says. The low church approach is more along the lines of something that you believe and are convicted of. That is what is spiritually accomplished in you. So the low church variety of Christianity, what you would find in Appalachia more often, is something much more spontaneous. It was supposed to be more sincere that way. And when I do have conversations with Baptists, for instance, and we talk about different styles of worship, I will say, well, my prayer book gives me better ideas, better theology, more beautifully expressed than I could come up with on my own. But my Baptist friend will tell me, yes, but you're saying those things and you won't necessarily mean what you say. And God will much more value a sincere prayer than a prayer that says the right things. So you see the difference in the focus there. The testimony, we've talked about that in the context of the Puritans once before. This is also a very important mode of religious life in the Southern Mountains among the Scotch-Irish, where in order to become a member of a church, you are expected to tell the story of your emotional, religious, personal experience. So what is highly valued in that context is a story of sin and corruption that is awakened through a spiritual and emotional experience, a particular point in time in which one believes that one has been called by God to salvation. And this marks the moment of change in one's life. Now, in many of these low church varieties of Protestantism, that kind of story is what is required in order to be a member of that congregation. So we see there is a certain similarity there. Both of them, both the Puritans and the Appalachian low church Christians, have a certain thing in common there as far as how they approach church membership, and also the radical departure there from those sacramental forms that were more common in the Church of England. Now, the variety of religion that we find here, however, seems to be traditional in another sense. So we've talked about the radical character of Puritan Protestantism in New England, how they wanted to root out all evil influences in the religion, everything that they deemed too associated with Roman Catholicism. They were eager to destroy in their folkways. In the Scotch-Irish experience, there was no such paranoia. Now, why that was, I can't say. It is a mysterious fact of that folkway, however, that they tended to hold Christian heritage in high regard. Let's take a look here at the quotes on the screen. What's called the older religiousness of the South. This is something that's celebrated in a lot of literature from Southern scholars like M.E. Bradford and Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver wrote an essay about this on the older religiousness of the South. And this is something celebrated about Southern folkways just generally, that Southerners remain the most religious section of the country, and in many respects the most traditional in their religion in the United States. And this area is one of the most religious areas in the Western world at this point. And this has been a characteristic aspect. It's certainly something strongly shared among the Scotch-Irish. They valued religious adherence, and they were not inclined to argue or have enmity one with another. Now, this is by far a low church Protestant area. There are pockets of Roman Catholics, mostly in towns and cities, but these are low church Protestants that Weaver describes when he says, "The travelers expressed a double amazement at the multiplicity of sects and at the lack of friction or ill will between them." So he's describing the multiplicity of low church Protestant sects, such as Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so on, and many groups in between them. For instance, there are quite a few varieties of Baptist in this region. They tended to multiply in variety after revival meetings and such. There would be very intense religious experiences followed by little or no instruction in theology, because the traveling preacher or evangelist would move on to the next community. And so people were left to figure things out on their own, and that frequently meant a split with the older forms of religion in that region. But a traveler, or not a traveler, a newspaper in Kentucky wrote about these people, that the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and seceders are the prevailing sects in the region. Now, the seceders, that's just a observation that groups came into being from separating themselves from older groups, illustrating what I was describing just a moment ago. The newspaper, it says, "They manifest a spirit of harmony and liberality toward each other. Religion is nowhere more respected than in Kentucky." Now, this is a really extraordinary thing. When we find religious sectarians in Western Europe, for instance, it is always an occasion of war and multi-generational violence and conflict. So it's quite extraordinary that these people came to the backcountry, Kentucky and Tennessee and such, and did not find that an occasion for conflict and violence among themselves. They were more inclined to think the best of one another. And that certainly was not the case with the Puritans, as we saw previously. The Puritans were more inclined to strictly order their communities on religious lines and to chastise and persecute those that stepped out of those boundaries. So we could say this was a far more laissez-faire approach to religion. However, religious values and religious obligations did not seem to suffer from that, which seems paradoxical, but nevertheless was true. Religion was truly respected, and those religious dogmas and obligations continued to be a major part of people's lives. Now, I realize I've just monologued a tremendous amount, and I've given you a lot of material, but I think that it would be best if we had a part two on this subject of the Scotch-Irish. This is a very rich subject, and we have plenty more we can talk about here.
Oh, definitely. And my thoughts on it are obviously, I'd rather have two full episodes than either one rushed one. And so what I think I'll probably do, if you're okay with it, is have you on again soon for us to finish this up. And then I'll probably release them, relatively closely within a week or two. But again, thank you so much, Bagby. This was incredibly in depth. And part of the reason you didn't hear a lot of me is that, really, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to speak it at length. I say this as someone who comes from this background, similarly to you, at least partially, right? That a lot of this I had no idea, right? No one really explains to you where that term Scotch-Irish comes from. Although, if you asked me to draw a picture of someone who is Scotch-Irish, I think you and I would probably come up with similar pictures, right? And I think that, in this broad context, what you and I are doing is talking about and exploring the different groups of heritage Americans, right? The people who made this country what it was. And obviously, the version of it you're told in school is only the Pilgrims, right? That's all there is. And really, there are a multitude of different peoples who came together to make America, right? I'm not trying to make some kind of like multicultural melting pot point, but to say that there are multiple traditions within America. And this is obviously mine. I have a great deal of affection for it, but it warrants more discussion than just Columbus and Plymouth Rock.
Absolutely, and they give our country its color and its peculiar characters. People, intellectual eggheads like John Adams makes a lot of sense coming out of Massachusetts, and fiery. Kind of devil-may-care sort of personalities like Andrew Jackson. He makes an awful lot more sense coming from Tennessee. When you understand the backgrounds of these characters, you see where these people get their lights, get their inspirations, what kinds of stories they're telling themselves. It makes them into different characters and gives the tapestry of American history its vibrant light.
So we are like I said, fast approaching time, and as you guys can probably tell, I'm a little bit under the weather, so my brain isn't quite firing on all cylinders. But Bagby, again, thank you so much for coming out. And if people are interested in you and your work, what's the best way for them to find more of it?
Check me out on X. I am at Tallman Books on X. I have a couple of new books out that I'd like to promote, one of which is the collected shorter writings of Charles Francis Adams Jr. I was very interested in Charles Francis Adams for a long time because he had traveled around the country promoting the heritage and remembrance of Robert E. Lee. And he was a Union Brigadier General of Volunteers and the grandson of President John Quincy Adams and the great-grandson of President John Adams. So he was a real New England blue blood who praised the memory of Robert E. Lee. Now, he had some of his own reasons for doing so. He was a Unionist, after all, and he fought for the Union. But I was long interested in him and could not find any of his materials collected and made available. So I went and did it myself. The book is called Memory, Union, and Empire, and that is one of my recent releases for Tallman Books. You can find a link to buy Memory, Union, and Empire that's pinned to my profile on my Twitter handle. So at Tallman Books on X, you will find a link there where you can buy at a wholesale price Memory, Union, and Empire, the collected shorter writings of Charles Francis Adams Jr.
Well, and I highly recommend your books. I own not all of them, but several of them, and they're all very high quality, rare things you cannot find elsewhere. But again, Bagby, thank you so much for coming on. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the show, you can either do so directly with the cryptocurrency links in the description, or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Spent some time on the phone with JD the other day, and that business is doing very well, which is really exciting to hear because JD is one of our guys, and the service he offers is invaluable. Right? We have it's not just for young guys. We have a number of older guys who are trying to just improve their health and stick around for their families, and so it's something that if you've made it this far, you can use. And again, I like JD, so I feel no guilt about shilling his brand. Again, guys, thank you so much for all the support. It's been very hopeful for me just watching this grow steadily. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.